Right. We've been looking at the book of Proverbs and noticing, centering in on the first 11 chapters where the points are made about wisdom. In the last several chapters, you had wisdom speaking or personified. Chapter 8, it was personified, speaking about wisdom, and then chapter 9 had wisdom doing the speaking and making her plea to the people. Before that, you had the immoral woman or the foreigner or the seductress, whichever way you want to look at that by the various translations. That was speaking and giving her kind of address to them. And so you noted that big difference between wisdom and that of the seductress. Now we get into chapter 10. In chapter 10, when you look at that in verse 1, what does it start out saying? The what? Proverbs of Solomon. So this is one of those places, as we said, that you have kind of that initial little statement of making attribution to whoever it is. Later on, we'll have some other things that are given from Solomon, King Lemuel, various others that are there, and they're attributed to them. But this is just a collection of proverbs that go through various subjects. Might be one subject one time, the very next verse a different one, beyond that the next verse. Just going through these various statements of wisdom. Very rarely do they take more than a couple of 2 or 3 verses that are together in the same one. And we'll notice that as we go through these. Tonight's then on the idea of parents and children. Want to try to do something getting this started. I had various thoughts about how we can organize doing this, but I'm going to try it one way. If that doesn't work, we'll try it another way next time. But I want to start out on these proverbs having to do with a wise or foolish son affects the happiness or sorrow of the parents. Who wants to take chapter 10 and verse 1? Clayton, okay. Chapter 10, verse 5. Going to take about 3 of them in a row here, Aaron. And then chapter 13 and verse 1. Okay, go ahead. All right, Clayton.
Proverbs of Solomon. A wise son maketh a glad father, but a foolish son is the heaviness of his mother.
Okay, 10:5.
He who gathers in summer is a wise son. He who sleeps in harvest is a son who causes shame.
Okay, and 13:1. Okay. What do you notice that connects all 3 of those? What do they bring up? All right. A wise son is being spoken of with regard to what he is like or what he does or what the effect of it is. And in chapter 10 and verse 1, it's that he makes the parent glad. Chapter 10 and verse 5, that he's industrious. And what about in chapter 13? What do you have in chapter 13 and verse 1? All right, his obedience or his listening to instruction rather than being a scoffer. And so it talks about the best way for that child to learn from the parent or from the father that is here in this case. All right. Chapter 5, or chapter 15 and verse 5. Who wants to do that one? Go ahead, DJ. And chapter 17, 21. Go ahead, Matt. And 17, 25. Doug. Okay, 15, 5.
A fool despises his father's instruction, but he who receives correction is prudent.
Okay. Chapter 17, verse 21.
He who sires a fool gets himself sorrow, and the father of a fool has good wood.
Okay. And 17:25.
A foolish son is a grief to his father, bitterness to her who bore him.
Okay. So now what do we have? What pulls all those together? Foolish son. So the opposite. There was the wise, and then now the foolish are being brought together. And in chapter 15 and in verse 5, the point of that passage is that one despises the correction or discipline, the wisdom that is given to him by the father. Chapter 17, you have a couple of those statements made. Verse 21, that one said, "He that begets a fool doeth it to his sorrow." So the effect upon the father of this foolish son is going to be that which is the opposite of a wise son. It's going to be a problem, a detriment that's to him. In chapter 25, what about the foolish son there? He's what? Grief to his father and what? Bitterness to his mother, okay. What's the point of that? Does that mean that a child who is foolish, who rejects counsel or rejects wisdom, does it affect the parents two different ways? What's the point on this? Because it's the father, verse 25 says, to have grief and bitterness to the mother. Is that really making a point that there's a different effect, or is it just trying to say things two different ways in a parallelism? The latter is probably the case that is there, that in some cases it may bring a bitterness. Why would it bring bitterness to see a child going the opposite way from the way directed? Why would that tend to make a parent bitter? Go ahead.
No, it's no joy to the parents, and this is an ongoing thing. It's not like you're sorrowful one day and then you're over it. This is an ongoing sorrow that just does not go away.
You have a case here of you bring a child to try to do what is the very best. If we're parents doing what we ought to be doing, we're trying to bring the very best for our children. And then to see a child who's just rebelling against that, going the opposite way, causing problems for the parents all the time, and doing this, kind of makes a parent go, how'd I get here? I mean, why is this happening? You know, kind of a thing. The bitterness would be there. Now, do we just give in to that bitterness if that's the case? No. The point is, repeatedly, we've got to keep onward with the idea of trying to bring about the best, looking for the hope that is there, and trying to bring about the good, the grief that is there. Any parent who's had a child go the wrong direction understands the grief that is there. It's a sorrow that won't go away. It's one that just keeps on multiplying in that life. Now, let's look at the next part of those. Chapter 19 and in verse 13. Who wants to take that one? Anybody? Okay. Foster. 19:27. Anybody? Go ahead. Kai. And then 23, 15, and 16. Okay, Kyle. Or Tyler. That was Kyle. All right, first one.
19:13. A foolish son is the ruin of his father, and the contentions of a wife are continual drifting.
Okay. There we got a new something introduced. Verse 27 of chapter 19.
Cease listening to instruction, my son, and you will stray from the words of knowledge.
Okay. And then chapter 23, verses 15 and 16.
My son, if your heart is wise, my heart will rejoice. Indeed, I myself. Yes, my inmost being will rejoice when your lips speak right things.
Okay. Here you have just general admonitions then. First, you start off talking about the wise son, then a foolish son, and now these general admonitions that are there with regard to the children in that way. Look at that first one that is given. Was that 17:21 that I had you read? Or do what? Okay. All right. 9:30. Yeah, of course it is. 19:13. I was going too far back there. A foolish son is calamity to his father. What's that mean? Calamity. Do what? Somebody might have said something back there.
New King James says
Ruin, okay. Or a destruction that is there in some other translation. How so? You ever seen a child, a son, daughter, whatever, that brought about a way of ruin or destruction to their parents? How could that happen? Go ahead.
They can bring reproach on the church. They bring reproach on your family name if you live in, small town where everybody knows everybody. It brings, they get into trouble with the law and stuff, and it's in the paper, so everybody knows. I mean, there's lots of ways you can bring reproach, not to mention how it makes you feel so bad because they've done that.
Okay. Go ahead.
kind of, especially in this time, your family as a unit, that's how you made money, that's how you lived in like a tribe. Everybody took care of everybody else, and if you had a son stray off, they wasn't holding their part of the work that needed done.
Okay. If they're, go ahead, DJ.
I was thinking it could, if this son falls away, the father could follow in suit by kind of trying to accept that.
Yep, that can happen too. I've always noted the fact that there will be a whole lot more, I think, people that will be lost by the way they reacted to their children's apostasy than really doing it their own than we really think. A lot of times it is a tendency to try to justify that. What about if they do something that brings about a great deal of destruction of property or maybe legal costs incurred? You can end up with a humongous debt of a child that goes wrong and is destructive in that sort of a way, and the parent had nothing to do with it, but still is going to be one that bears the brunt of that. Anything else there? The idea then of admonition, there is an effect. Even though you'd say, well, it's not me doing that, there's an effect on me as a parent with what happens with the children. There's an effect, as everybody talked about, just not just the idea of reputation or effects of my sadness or whatever might be there, or on the other side of that, a good that comes to that if it's good things. But the effect is there, even though I did nothing, that this child also has an effect on that family, and there's going to be some results, positive or negative, that come there from that. Anybody else on that one? Okay, go ahead.
To teach a son wisely, you have to be wise.
There has to be a wisdom there that's being imparted.
That's right. It starts at the foundation and works out, So you have to be teaching them the right things for them to be wise. And then, we see child in here and we think of a little kid up to 20 years old. Now, that may be when you have most of the time to influence them, but they're still your child when you're 100 and they're 80. They're still your child. And you have to continue to pray, because I've seen kids be the perfect child until 40 and then drop off, or just different ages and different reasons and different things. So it's always a continuation, even though they're not as much under your control, and that's the way God planned it. As they get older, there's still an influence that you can have on them in certain ways.
And there's result. Look at the positive side of that. In Proverbs 23, 15 and 16, it was pointed out, my son, if your heart is wise, then what does the father respond? Solomon says, my heart will rejoice, indeed, I myself. Yes, my innermost being will rejoice when your lips speak right things. When you look at a child that does that which is right, not because of what you told them to do, but because they had that in them. They decided to go that direction. How does that make a parent feel? It doesn't get much better than that. There is that sense of joy from that, a goodness of feeling, a recognition that path has been brought into bear in the life, and now it's being put forth in that life. Now the lesson is learned not just in the mind, but in taking that over in the action there as well. Those last three, who wants 23, 24, and 25? Chapter 23, okay. Gerald. Chapter 27, verse 11. Anybody? Ryan? Okay. And chapter 28 and verse 7. Okay, Bo. All right. Gerald, chapter 23, 24, and 25.
The father of the righteous shall greatly rejoice, and he that begetteth a wise child shall have joy of him. Thy father and thy mother shall be glad, and she that bare thee shall rejoice.
Okay. Chapter 27, verse 11.
My son, be wise and make my heart glad, that I may answer him who reproacheth me.
Okay. And chapter 28 and verse 7.
Whoever keeps the law is a discerning man, but a companion of gluttons shames his father.
Okay. The what translation is that you've got?
New King James.
Okay. In the King James and the American Standard, it'll in both of those, whoso keepeth the law is a wise son. There, that's the literal statement. There's also some of the others that take that in a figurative sense. So that's why that one's included among those. The idea in all of those is what? That if that son is wise, if one's doing that which is good, imitating that which has been rightly taught, then there's a gladness that comes. There's an effect that is there that is always going to result in a cheerfulness about a parent because we love to see our children doing what's right, doing what's best. Why is that? I know that might seem like a strange question, but why? Why do we like to see our children doing things that are wise and right?
Well, when you've seen them do things that aren't wise, and then you see them do the wise things, it's just, for one, they're doing right, they're going to have the eternal life in heaven.
All right.
You know, it's a reflection on you whether they're doing right or wrong.
All right. And that's the main one I was getting at is I recognize when they're doing right, that's a path that affects them for good. Do you grieve if you have a child that gets hurt and somehow damaged in their physical life in a permanent sort of way? Well, surely you do. What about in the spiritual life? That which has to do with the spiritual life can affect them by being lost eternally. That's something that has to grieve a parent in every day of their life, to recognize that that child is going the wrong direction as a result of that. There is a danger that they have to their soul. And so here the other side of that is that cheerfulness that is a part of that. All right, go ahead, Bo.
I'll just also say that it's kind of the way God made us too. If we correlate that to God as our Father and how we feel whenever our kids do what's right, and how sad we are when our kids do wrong.
Exactly.
Translating that to how God feels whenever we do what's right.
Exactly. That's right. Go ahead, James.
A lot of these I always think of, it's also making you reflect upon the pain and problems you have caused in your past, that you don't want to see them do the same.
Correct.
Just somewhat of experience knowing, please don't do that because I know.
Yeah.
And a lot of this is earthly wisdom that God has given us. And that's what it's for, is to help us train them up.
That's right.
So that we know.
That's right. Chuck, did you have something else? Kurt. I'm sorry. I've got all the names messed up tonight.
I'll answer it honestly. I think there's a time in our lives, if we're fortunate enough, God is willing, if we get old enough where we're understanding there will be days coming when we cannot take care of ourselves or cannot take care of everything about ourselves. The first ones you think of are your children. And if they are wise and if they have done well, and if you can trust them, that's a blessing and a comfort. To have foolish or irresponsible children does not give older people peace.
We also look at it in the sense of if we're trying to live a life that is right and live with wisdom, trying to have an effect in a certain direction that's there of right. When you look at a child, they're typically going to outlast you in this world. Do you want your influence and everything else of the way that you try to affect the world or bring about the good in the cause of Christ, do you want that to end with you? Well, of course not. You want that to go onward. And so you see that with children when they're ones who are in that right way of living for the things of right, standing for the truth. Then you know there's somebody else that's going to be standing there where you've stood, and that is a good thing. The other side of that is when they aren't, and they stand with what you stood against, what's the effect of that? Recognize that there's something where when I'm dead and gone, here's somebody going to be going the other. I can't imagine much worse than that, is to recognize that that opposite kind of an effect will be there of those children who do not follow the way of path that's right, but they go in a rebellion in another direction away from the Lord and away from His truth. Anybody else there on that? All right, this next section that we get to, corrective discipline and proper instruction, are part of love for the child. I'm going to do the same thing. Take this kind of three at a whack here as we go. 13:24. Who wants to read that? Okay, Doug. 19:18. Anybody? Go ahead. And then 22, verse 6. Go ahead, Foster. All right. 13:24.
He who spares his rod hates his son, but he who loves him disciplines him promptly.
Okay. 19:18.
Chasten thy son while there is hope, and let not thy soul spare for his crying.
Okay. Then 22:6.
Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it.
Okay. All right. In these three that you have, the first two are most closely related. What's the point in them and trying to, what kind of similar point are they making? First one, you chasten the son how? Promptly. The second one, chasten the son while what? There's hope. Are those related? If you do not do it promptly, then what happens? The message isn't taken. As a result of that, that correction is not made. And there's no hope of correcting it if we let it stretch on and on and on. That's the idea that's there with any correction. Needs to be one where a child still has in mind what it's about. I see sometimes parents say, when I get you home, I'm going to correct that. Forget it. It's too late. I mean, unless your kids are a lot different from mine, they play for 10 minutes or 15 minutes, they're totally forgot what was going on before. There has to be something of tying that misbehavior to the correction that's found. That's what it's talking about, promptly, or while there is hope, not letting it go on and on. If we let it go on and on and on, and later on we decide, well, now we're going to try to stop that, how does that work? It's not going to do it. A lot of times I'll talk to people, especially when I'm dealing with younger couples, as we're talking about marriage. We talk about children and correction of children, and a lot of times that causes problems in a marriage when they figure out after they have kids that they don't agree with each other on how to deal with that. And so I always bring that up in classes with them, and we talk about that for a class. If you decide, here, I'm going to accept this at a time, and you decide to change that down the line, there's very little chance that you're going to have a lot of effect. Child's not going to recognize that as being something that you take all that seriously if you've let it happen for this long altogether. Sometimes one says, well, I made a rule, and I shouldn't have made that rule. What'd I do? You know, the best thing to do is think about that rule before you make it real well. Once you've started the rule, when you decide that you're going to let loose of that after an argument from a child, you just got yourself in trouble. Because what's going to happen is that's going to happen with other rules as well. So it's good to think about them. But when you make a rule, it's a rule. And it needs to be enforced in the time of that action that's done contrary to the rule. Anybody else got anything there?
Harry,
Yes, go ahead.
often when you discipline early, the magnitude of the discipline is a lot less than if you let it fester. Then you've got to get more severe with the
That's right.
implications.
When you see a temper tantrum with a child, what tends to happen over time with that temper tantrum?
Walmart, they get their way.
What goes on with their behavior, that misbehavior of the child? I recognize that we're not on Walmart is the right example here. What happens to that child starting to throw a temper tantrum? You let it go, what's going to happen? Do what? Okay, there you are. It builds up. I've never seen a tantrum cool down in a kind of a way on that kind of thing. It gets worse and worse. Now you might say, well, it didn't at that time. He messed up his vocal cords and got to where he couldn't scream. Well, maybe so. But the next time he'll scream even more. And this is a building kind of a thing. That's why you take care of it quickly. Like Doug just pointed out, if you do, you get it on that lesser part, down that smaller problem. That's always where it's going to be easier to correct. Go ahead, James.
Well, also in the second part, 15, the rod of correction derives from far from them.
Okay.
And, you know, that rod, we think of that in today's terms, that being abuse, and it's really not. It was just a form of method that they used back then. They literally used a rod on the backside, and that's what he's talking about. And, but not just that, it shows the firmness that needs to be taken when there is this kind of misconduct. Whatever punishment you choose to use, it has to be firm. And that's the seriousness of verse 15. It's not just about whatever punishment you're using. It's got to be firm.
When we're involved in the questions, when we get to those, chances are that'll be next week now. I want to deal with that and talking about what the rod is. May not be a particular rod or something like that we're talking about. That's an encompassing kind of a thing for correction in whichever way it's going to happen. Fact is, you have different children. You're going to have to learn different ways of correction. Because some will work for one that won't work for another at all. And you'll have to do some other things there to get the same effect. Go ahead.
One other aspect other than it just escalates and gets worse is that we've taught the kid that he's got a method of getting his way.
That's right. And that's something that's very dangerous. For them not to know who the boss is is a wrong kind of a pattern to get started. All right, go ahead, Kurt.
You mentioned this in regard to taking care of the training quickly, but I think it also applies to taking care of the training when they're young. What jumps into my mind is teaching children the appropriate ways to dress. I always cringe when people get their child involved in sports or activities where, you know, it's cute when they're 3, but when she's 16, you want her dressing that way?
Right.
You know, the rules
Absolutely.
don't change or should not change for dress when age changes. You know
Yeah.
where I'm going with that?
That's right. The training is a consistent training that we're trying to do. All right. In that one of chapter 22 and verse 6, train up a child in the way that he shall go. When he's old, he'll not depart from it. I want to take that question that we've got on that point, the question number 9 there. Some say that this is an absolute standard. If you have a child go away at any time, that was proof that the parents were not what they should have been, did not train as they should. Others would point out that the Proverbs are a general rule. It emphasizes the fact that if they're trained, they're more likely to be those who would stay in a way of right. Which one is it? I think all of you know I take the second viewpoint. The idea of something being an absolute is not what's stated in all the Proverbs. The point is, this is a general way. Generally, someone who is slothful as a young person will be slothful as an old person. That's part of the Proverbs as well. Sometimes they aren't. They learn better. They figure out they aren't going to eat or something, and so they change that. But it's more likely to continue than not to continue. I think that's the point here. If we could say it is an absolute rule that if a child is taught right, that child will not go astray, then who is to blame for anyone who's lost? The parent. Is that what the Bible teaches? The soul that sinneth what? It shall die. So we need to remember this, that idea of this being a absolute, that is something that I can see for sure that the parents did wrong. If the child does wrong, that's not the point. The point is you give your child the best opportunity when you act in a way of training them up in the way that they'll go. And the general rule is then they'll not depart from it. There's also a point that I see when you have parents raising a child the way that they should. You sometimes have a child go astray, and then later, what do they recognize? I goofed up. I need to turn this around. And that's there. Never forget that your training is there somewhere in that skull of a child as you put it in. What we hear before we're 8 years old, we're told stays with us, period. But it's part of that permanent brain that is there of those kind of effects upon the brain. When something's taught in that time, it's going to be there all the time. That doesn't mean they're going to always go with it or it's always right there on a recall, but it's something that is a part of that child. When you teach a child what's right and according to truth, and you teach them the Word of God, they may go away from it, but that truth hasn't left their mind. Don't ever forget that. That truth is there, and your hope is that it'll come back in and kick in and be that goad that'll cause them to come back in time to the way of truth. Go ahead, David.
A couple of thoughts. Not only train, it is a work. You know, and the thought on that is you're going to allow it to happen, or you're going to train it to happen. But either way, it's training. And to the thought of, goes astray, then it's the parent's fault. Well, the other side of that is, if you were taught error, sometimes you got to overcome your training. You have to grow up and realize what the truth is and follow it, despite it if you were taught in error.
That's right. You've got that responsibility.
It is on the one.
That's right. So I see a hand over here. Okay, go ahead. Oh.
Just made me think of the parable of the prodigal son, and when he came to his senses to go back to his father, and so David was saying the work and the training of teaching them, and putting it into their head that they do fall away. Hopefully, they have that moment where they come to their senses and come back.
Yep, and any of us who've been parents that have seen children go a different direction, or we're looking, in a figurative sense, hoping that that'll be the time for sure. Steve, go ahead.
Just getting back to, and David kind of touched on it a little bit, but getting back to the absolute of if this is train up a child and if you do what you're supposed to do, they will never err, then it also would mean if you don't train up a child in the way they should, then they never can be saved. So it can't be an absolute, because when you take the opposite side, which it has to be, if that's the way it is. So that, in my mind, answers that question.
That kind of thinking seems to me to be very much an influence of some Calvinistic type thought, because that's the kind of thing you have there as well, of once saved, always saved. These kinds of things, they tend in that direction. Problem is they don't work the other direction either. They want to say, oh, no, that doesn't go this way, but it goes that way. And the fact of it is, we're individually responsible. That's the point that's made. But a parent can have an important effect upon that child in that training to give them the best opportunity towards doing what is right. Doesn't guarantee it, but it certainly gives them an advantage in that sort of way. Anybody else got anything on those? Okay. Now, let's go to the next ones. Chapter 22:15. Who wants that one? Jamie? 23:13 and 14. DJ? 29:15. Go ahead, Kim. And then 29:17. Anybody? Go ahead, Tyler. All right. 22:15.
Foolishness is bound up in the heart of a child. The rod of correction will drive it far from him.
Okay. The next one, 23:13 and 14.
Do not withhold correction from a child, for if you beat him with the rod, he will not die. You shall beat him with the rod and deliver his soul from hell.
Okay. Let's see, I'm trying to get that. 29:15.
The rod and rebuke give wisdom, but a child left to himself aims to his mother.
Okay. 29:17.
Correct your son, and he will give you rest. Yes, he will give delight to your soul.
Okay. We don't have time to go in through all of these, so I'm going to go ahead and take that point on the rod here rather than waiting until we get to the question. When it talks about the rod, that's particularly what is discussed in this passage, or in the Proverbs a great deal. Point was made, I think, James, did you speak on that? That was a common way of correction. That was what was taken for correction. If you notice what is done today in some places, I think I noted in Singapore, there was some American kid that put graffiti on a car and he got the caning as a result of that. That's pretty much what they had of a caning, was pretty much the idea of what was there for a rod, as it was called, of correction in Bible times. That seems to be so. Now, does that mean that's all we can use? All right, it's a symbol. It stands for what? correction in whatever way that there's going to be. Now, it could be corporal correction, could be a physical thing, or it could be some different things. How many of you have had multiple children that they reacted exactly the same way to every single kind of discipline? Same thing. Anybody? We only had 2 and they didn't either. What do you notice about children in correction?
Moving target.
Do what?
It's a moving target.
Know that. Besides that. Sure.
They react to it in a different way.
Okay.
You know, our example, one could be a little hard-headed, a little set in his or her way. You know, and
I can't imagine that.
well, I'm talking like of a friend.
Yeah, yeah.
Then one can be a tender heart and easy, and real easy to discipline. You know,
All right. Now, if you tried the same thing with those 2 types, what would be the effect?
parents would go crazy.
Yeah.
But if you wouldn't have an effect.
Yeah, and your child, it would have 2 different impacts on them.
Well,
You have a stubborn child, hard-headed child. You might have them. I won't say who of our children, but you know, in the auditorium at this time. But hard-headed to the point of you give them a spanking and look at them and say, "We're going to do this," and ow, you know. I never knew that happened to parents who actually disciplined children. I thought that happened only in the movies out there when there were kids who were allowed to go. But that drove me crazy. I thought, maybe this isn't going to work. But what we figured out is there were other ways of discipline, other things that were a whole lot more effective with one. The others, if you speak to them with a kind of a harsh voice, and I'm disappointed what you did, I can't believe you did that. I mean, might crack apart right there, just melt down to the floor. There are going to be different ways that'll bring an effect. Now, with the problem, I want to get this, and then we'll go on with some other discussion, but with the problem and trying to correct it, what's the first step? To get the child to understand what was done was wrong. Correct? If we do that, are we done with discipline? No. Now, what's the next step?
the discipline.
Okay, the discipline there, and then what? I included that with the correction that is there.
Then the teaching and the understanding.
Okay, then we're pointing them in the right way. Every time, if you look over at Hebrews 12, the peaceable fruits of righteousness that are the effect of the discipline there, isn't talking about just children, but children are a part of that discipline in context. But afterwards yields that peaceable fruit of righteousness. If you're giving the discipline and the child is still in the midst of rebellion, no, you haven't gotten there yet. You still got part number 1. But when you get to the end of the correction, recognition that that's wrong, understanding of that, there's the positive side of that still needs to be done. And sometimes parents forget that. And that is the teaching of the right way. And the fact that that leads us to peace. That allows the best. That allows the good. That's where we want to go with it. And so when you talk about the rod of correction, sometimes we think only in terms of a disciplinary measure or a disciplinary tool. Think of that as the idea of the corrective part of the discipline, but that isn't all that's involved in discipline. The other part of that is what's talked about in this last one, and that is the need for there to be a peaceableness that comes, a good that comes from that. You had something.
Yeah, there has to be a consistency on the disciplines, as in the rod and correction.
That's
You
right.
know, what comes before that child could react, but they were total polar opposites on
Yeah.
every one of them. But there had to be that punishment in the middle of it, that had to be consistent every time.
Yeah.
No matter how they took it, whether they took it kicking and screaming or,
Yeah.
more or less a challenge that I couldn't hurt,
Yeah. Go ahead, Steve.
I think it's important too that every time we say the word discipline, automatically people always think of punishment.
Right.
You have it correctly up there, corrective discipline,
Yeah.
which is the punishment.
And that's why I wanted those differences.
That discipline is training and the teaching of it.
Correct.
It's not just, that's just one small part of it. The
That's right.
punishment,
And that
discipline,
has to always have that other side of pointing the right way and pointing out how that is good and leads to peace. Those kind of things need to be there. The good side of that does not need to be forgotten. All right. We're out of time, so I'm going to ask Kevin, if you will, to lead us in a word of prayer, and we'll be dismissed. We'll continue on with this next time, but remember to pick up the sheets for the one beyond that are in the back. Go ahead, Kevin, and we'll be dismissed.